The fourth day after the crash began with something that had not happened since they arrived on the alien planet. Everyone woke up feeling hopeful instead of desperate. The crew members who had tried the foraged foods were noticeably stronger and more alert than those who were still too scared to eat anything. Captain Tae-woo had become the unofficial leader of their survival efforts, and he started the day by organizing the crew into small groups for different tasks he knew that they needed to establish a routine if they were going to survive long enough for rescue ships to find them. Bryn had made a remarkable recovery after eating the plant stir-fry, and her natural engineer instincts were starting to take over. She was using her small hands and sharp teeth to build tools and containers from pieces of the wrecked ship. Her fur was shiny again, and she was moving with quick, energetic movements. Dr. Yuki had set up a medical station where she could monitor everyone's health and treat any problems that came up. She was keeping careful records of which foods worked best for each species and which ones caused any negative reactions. Clicks had regained enough strength to use his forearms effectively, and his compound eyes were perfect for spotting things that the others missed. He could see colors and patterns that were invisible to the other species, which made him very good at finding hidden fruits and berries. Earth was still recovering slowly because his rocky body needed special minerals to repair itself, but he was using his geological knowledge to help them understand the soil and water conditions on the planet. His deep voice was getting stronger each day. The other survivors were starting to work together in ways that would have been impossible before the crash. Their different abilities and knowledge were combining to create a survival system that was better than what any single species could have achieved alone. Tae-woo decided that they needed to establish a regular schedule for food gathering and preparation. He divided the crew into morning and afternoon foraging teams, with each group focusing on different types of plants and different areas of the forest. The morning team consisted of Bryn Clicks and 3 other crew members who were good at moving quickly and quietly through the forest. They focused on gathering berries and fruits that grew high up in the trees and required climbing or reaching skills. The afternoon team included Zorth and the larger, stronger crew members who could carry heavy loads and dig up roots and tubers from the forest floor. They also looked for mushrooms and other fungi that grew in dark, damp places. Tae-woo moved between both teams, teaching them how to identify safe plants and avoid dangerous ones. He showed them how to test new foods by trying very small amounts first and waiting to see if there were any bad reactions. The learning process was not always easy. Some of the crew members got stomach aches from eating too much of certain plants too quickly. Others discovered that foods that were safe for one species could cause problems for another species. Bryn found out that she had a special talent for finding the sweetest berries and fruits. Her small nose could detect subtle chemical signals that told her when fruit was perfectly ripe. She also discovered that her sharp teeth were perfect for opening tough seed pods and nuts. Clicks learned that his compound eyes could spot camouflage plants and animals that were invisible to the others. He could see ultraviolet patterns on flowers that led him to hidden nectar sources. He also found that his forearms made him very efficient at gathering large quantities of food. Earth discovered that his knowledge of rocks and minerals helped him find the best places to dig for roots and tubers. He could tell by looking at the soil which areas would have the most nutritious plants growing in them. Dr. Yuki found that her medical training helped her understand how different foods affected the various alien biologies. She started creating a guide that showed which plants were best for each species and how to prepare them safely. The crew members who had been most resistant to eating natural foods were slowly starting to change their minds as they watched their companions getting stronger and healthier. Some of them were still too scared to try anything, but they were beginning to ask questions about food preparation. As the days passed, the survivors started to develop their own cooking techniques and recipes. They learned to combine different plants to create more complex flavors and better nutrition. They also figured out how to preserve some foods so they would last longer. The fire pit that Tae-woo had built became the center of their camp, where everyone gathered to cook and eat together. The shared meals created a sense of community that transcended the differences between species. The aliens began to share stories about their homeworlds and their traditional foods. Many of them had grown up eating only processed foods, but they had heard legends about the old days when their ancestors ate natural foods told stories about his people, ancient festivals where they would gather flower nectar and tree sap to celebrate the changing seasons. His species had once been connected to the natural cycles of their planet. Before they moved to artificial habitats, Earth shared memories of his grandfather who had told him about the great mineral gardens where his ancestors had cultivated special rocks and crystals for food. His people had once been farmers before they became miners and engineers. Bryn remembered songs that her grandmother had sung about the wild berry fields and nut groves where her people had lived before they developed industrial food production. Her species had once been gatherers and foragers like the small mammals they resembled. Even the crew members, who were still too scared to eat natural foods, were fascinated by these stories. They were beginning to realize that their modern diets were actually a very recent development in the history of their species. Dr. Yuki was documenting everything. They learned about alien plant biology and nutrition. She was creating a database that could be valuable to scientists throughout the galaxy. The information they were gathering could help other species rediscover their own traditional foods. Taewoo was amazed by how quickly the crew members were adapting to their new situation. The beings who had been helpless and terrified just a few days ago were now working together as an efficient team. Each species was contributing their unique abilities to the group's survival effort. The forest around their camp was becoming familiar territory as they learned to navigate through it safely. They established regular routes to the best foraging areas and set up temporary shelters where they could rest during long gathering expeditions. By the end of the first week, the survivors had created a sustainable food system that was keeping everyone healthy and well-fed. They had learned to work with the natural environment instead of fighting against it. The transformation was remarkable. The crew members who had been dying of starvation were now stronger and more energetic than they had been before the crash. The natural foods were providing nutrients that their processed diets had been missing. For years, they were no longer just surviving, they were beginning to thrive. The alien planet that had seemed so hostile and dangerous was actually providing everything they needed to live healthy, productive lives. The knowledge that Taewoo had shared with them was changing their understanding of what it meant to be alive and connected to the natural world. They were rediscovering wisdom that their civilizations had forgotten in their rush toward technological advancement. 2 hours had passed since Captain Taewoo had eaten the alien plant stir-fry, and something amazing was happening. Instead of getting sick or dying, he was actually getting stronger and healthier. His skin had regained its normal color and his movements were becoming more confident and energetic. The alien crew members were still watching him with disbelief. They had been absolutely certain that eating wild plants would kill him, but instead, he looked better than he had since before the crash. He was walking around the camp area, checking on everyone and organizing their supplies with renewed vigor. Bryn was the first to notice the change in the human captain. Her small fuzzy ears were very sensitive to sounds, and she could hear that his heartbeat was stronger and more regular than before. Her nose was also picking up chemical signals that told her his body was healthy and functioning well. Dr. Yuki was using her medical scanner to check Taewoos' vital signs, and she was amazed by what she found. His blood pressure was normal, his temperature was perfect, and his brain activity showed that he was more alert than he had been in days. The alien plants had not poisoned him at all. Clicks was still very weak, but his compound eyes were focused on the human captain with intense curiosity. His species had very advanced knowledge of biology and chemistry, and he could not understand how organic matter from an unknown planet could be safe to eat. Earth was making low rumbling sounds that meant he was thinking very hard about what he had witnessed. His rocky species had evolved to process only specific types of minerals, and the idea that any creature could eat random plants and survive was completely foreign to his understanding. The other survivors were starting to whisper among themselves in their various alien languages. They were debating whether what they had seen was real or if they were all hallucinating from hunger. Some of them thought that maybe the human had special immunity to plant toxins. As the hours passed and Taewoo continued to show no signs of illness or poisoning, the aliens began to realize that their assumptions about food might be wrong. The human was not only surviving but thriving on what they had thought was inedible matter. Bryn was the first to overcome her fear and approach the human captain. Her small body was trembling with hunger, and the smell of the cooked plants was making her stomach growl loudly. Her species had evolved from small mammals, and some ancient instinct was telling her that the cooked food might be safe. She approached Tewa very slowly with her small hands extended in a gesture of submission. Her fur was standing up with nervousness, but her eyes were fixed on the remaining stir-fry that was still sitting in the makeshift cooking pan. Tewa understood what she was asking for, and he smiled at her in a way that was meant to be reassuring. He took a small portion of the cooked plants and offered it to her on a piece of clean metal. The mixture was still warm and smelled like nothing she had ever experienced before. Bryn sniffed the food very carefully, using her sensitive nose to analyze its chemical composition. The smell was completely different from the nutrition tubes she was used to, but it did not trigger any of her instinctive warnings about dangerous substances. With her small hands shaking, she took the tiniest possible bite of the cooked plants and held it in her mouth for a long time before swallowing. The taste was strange and complex with flavors that she had never experienced before, but it was not unpleasant. Almost immediately, she felt a surge of energy flowing through her small body. The natural sugars and nutrients in the plants were exactly what her starving system needed. Her fur began to regain its shine, and her movements became more steady and coordinated. The other survivors watched in amazement as Bryn not only survived eating the alien plants, but actually seemed to be getting better. Her small tail started wagging, which was a sign that she was feeling happy and healthy for the first time since the crash. Encouraged by Bryn's success, Clicks managed to drag himself closer to where Tewu was sitting. His forearms were still weak, but he was determined to try the food that had restored the human and the small furry creature. His species needed liquid nutrition, but maybe the plant juices would help. Tewu mashed up some of the berries and mixed them with water from the stream to create a kind of fruit juice that Clicks could drink. The liquid was purple and smelled sweet and fruity. Clicks used one of his 4 hands to lift the container to his mouth. The effect was almost immediate. His gray skin began to regain its blue color, and his compound eyes became clearer and more focused. The natural sugars in the berries were giving his body the energy it needed to start functioning properly again. One by one, the other survivors began to overcome their fear and prejudice about eating natural foods. Each species discovered that certain plants worked better for their biology than others. Zorth found that some of the roots contained minerals that helped repair his rocky skin. The aliens, who had been raised on processed foods their entire lives, were discovering flavors and textures that their ancestors had known, but they had forgotten. The natural foods were not only keeping them alive, but were providing nutrients that their artificial diets had been missing. Dr. Yuki was fascinated by what she was observing. She had studied nutrition science and knew that processed foods often lacked many of the micronutrients that natural foods contained. The alien survivors were not just surviving, they were actually becoming healthier than they had been before the crash. As the day went on, more and more of the crew members tried the foraged foods. Each success gave the others courage to try different plants and combinations. The camp went from being a place of despair and starvation to a place where beings from different worlds were learning to work together. Tewu became a teacher, showing the aliens how to identify safe plants and how to prepare them properly. He explained that humans had evolved as omnivores, which meant they could eat many different types of food. His species had survived by being adaptable and resourceful. The aliens began to share their own knowledge about their homeworlds and their traditional foods. Many of them remembered stories that their grandparents had told about the old days when their species ate natural foods before they developed industrial food production. Clicks remembered legends about his ancestors who had eaten the nectar of flowers and the sap of trees before they learned to synthesize liquid nutrients in laboratories. His compound eyes were perfect for seeing the subtle differences between safe and dangerous plants. Earth recalled stories about his people eating mineral-rich rocks and metal ores in the early days of their civilization. His geological knowledge helped them understand which soils would produce the most nutritious plants. Even the most skeptical crew members were beginning to change their minds about natural foods when they saw how much better everyone was feeling. The fear and prejudice that had been programmed into them by their modern civilizations was being replaced by curiosity and wonder. They realized that in their rush to develop advanced technology and processed foods, They had lost touch with the basic knowledge that had allowed their species to survive and evolve. The human captain had not just saved their lives, he had reconnected them with their own forgotten heritage. As night fell on the third day after the crash, the survivors gathered around their small fire, sharing cooked plants and telling stories about their homeworlds. For the first time since the crash, they felt hope that they might not only survive but actually thrive on this alien world. The transformation had begun with one human refusing to give up and showing that sometimes the most primitive knowledge is actually the most advanced wisdom of all. The third day started with the sound of Bryn crying because she was so hungry that her small body was starting to shut down. Her fur had lost its shine and was falling out in patches. Her tiny hands were shaking so much that she could not hold anything. Captain Tawu knew that if he did not act soon, some of his crew members would declix. Was the worst off of all the survivors. His blue skin had turned almost gray and his forearms were hanging limp at his sides. His compound eyes were no longer focusing properly and his breathing was very shallow. Dr. Yuki said that his species could only survive about 4 days without food, and this was already day 3. Zorth was still sitting in the same corner where he had been yesterday. But now the cracks in his rocky skin were getting deeper and wider. His species absorbed minerals from their food to repair their stone bodies. Without proper nutrition, his body was literally crumbling apart. He had stopped talking completely and just stared at the wall. The other survivors were in similar conditions. Some were too weak to stand up and others were starting to become confused and disoriented from hunger. The shelter they had built from ship parts was starting to smell bad. Because some of the aliens were getting sick. Tae-woo had spent the night thinking about what he had to do. He knew that his crew members would rather die than eat what they thought was poisonous alien plants, but he also knew that the plants he had found were safe and nutritious. His human ancestors had survived for thousands of years by eating wild foods, and he trusted his instincts. He gathered up all the plant materials he had collected the day before and carried them outside the shelter, where he could work without scaring the others too much. He had found some flat pieces of metal from the ship hull that he thought he could use as a cooking surface. Using techniques he had learned in survival training, Tae-woo built a small fire. Using dry wood and some chemical fuel from the ship emergency supplies, the flames were hot and steady, and he carefully balanced the metal pieces over the fire to create a makeshift cooking surface. The smell of the fire attracted the attention of the other survivors who came to the entrance of the shelter to watch what he was doing. They were too weak to stop him, but they were making sounds of fear and disapproval in their various alien languages. Tae-woo began by washing the leafy green plants in water from the stream. He had tested them yesterday, and they tasted like a cross between spinach and lettuce. He also had some berries that were sweet and some roots that were starchy, like potatoes. He had even found some mushrooms growing on fallen logs. He placed the metal cooking surface over the fire and waited for it to get hot. When he dropped a few drops of water on it, they sizzled and disappeared, which meant it was ready for cooking. He added a little bit of oil that he had salvaged from the ship machinery. The sound of the oil hitting the hot metal made a loud sizzling noise that caused several of the aliens to cry out in alarm. They had never seen food cooked over an open fire before, and to them it looked like some kind of dangerous chemical reaction. Tae-woo added the leafy green plants to the hot oil and began stirring them around with a bent piece of antenna from the ship. The plants immediately began to change color and release a pleasant smell that reminded him of home-cooked meals on Earth. Bryn was the first to notice the smell, and she crept closer to see what was happening. Her small nose was twitching as she tried to identify the strange new odors. The smell was completely different from the sterile, processed foods she was used to, but something deep in her genetic memory was responding to it. The other survivors were backing away from the cooking fire and making sounds of terror and disgust. Through their universal translators, Tae-woo could hear them saying things like, "That is not food, and he will poison himself, and why is he burning the plants?" Clicks was too weak to move, but his compound eyes were fixed on the cooking process. He had never seen organic matter prepared this way before, and he was fascinated. Despite his fear, his species had legends about their ancestors eating natural foods, but those stories were thousands of years old. Zorth managed to rumble out a few words in his rocky voice, telling Tae-woo that he was making A terrible mistake, and that cooked plants were still poisonous plants. But even he seemed curious about what was happening despite his warnings. Dr. Yuki was watching from the shelter entrance with a worried expression on her face. She understood human biology better than the others, but she was still concerned about the risk of eating unknown alien plants. She had medical supplies to treat poisoning, but she was not sure they would work on alien plant toxins. Daewoo added the berries and mushrooms to the cooking mixture and continued stirring everything together. The plants were changing texture and becoming softer, while the berries were releasing their juices and creating a kind of sauce. The mushrooms were giving off a rich, earthy smell. The cooking process took about 10 minutes, and during that time the smell of the food spread throughout their camp area. Some of the aliens were holding their breathing apparatus to filter out the smell, while others were actually moving closer. Despite their fear, when the stir-fry was finished cooking, Daewoo removed it from the fire and let it cool down a little. He had created a colorful mixture of green plants, red berries, and brown mushrooms that looked nothing like any food the aliens had ever seen before. The moment of truth had arrived. Daewoo took a small bite of the cooked plant mixture and began to chew slowly. The taste was actually quite good, with the bitterness of the greens balanced by the sweetness of the berries and the rich flavor of the mushrooms. The alien crew members watched in complete silence as their human captain swallowed the first bite. They were expecting him to collapse immediately or start showing signs of poisoning. Instead, he took another bite, and then another larger one. "That is not edible," they all screamed at once in their various languages. The universal translators were working overtime to convert all the different words for poison and danger and death. The sound was so loud that it echoed through the forest and probably scared away any animals that might have been nearby. But Daewoo did not collapse or show any signs of illness. Instead, he continued eating the alien plant stir-fry with obvious enjoyment. His color was good, and his movements were steady and strong. The other survivors could not believe what they were seeing too. It looked like their captain had completely lost his mind and was eating what could only be described as cooked weeds and mushrooms. They were sure that he would die within minutes, but instead he seemed to be getting stronger and more energetic. Some of the aliens started to back away from him, thinking that he might be infected with some kind of alien madness that made him want to eat poisonous plants. Others were too fascinated to move and continued watching to see what would happen next. The smell of the cooked food was making some of their stomachs growl with hunger, even though their minds were telling them that it was dangerous. Their bodies were starting to recognize the smell as something that might actually be food. Daewoo finished eating about half of the stir-fry and then sat down to wait and see if he would have any bad reactions. He felt fine, and actually better than he had felt since the crash. His energy was returning, and his thinking was becoming clearer. The other survivors continued to watch him with a mixture of horror and fascination, wondering if their human captain had just saved them all or doomed himself to a terrible death. The second day after the crash was much worse than the first day. Everyone was getting hungry and scared, and some of the alien crew members were starting to act strange because they had not eaten anything since the day before the crash. The emergency food supplies had been scattered all over the forest when the ship broke apart, and most of it was ruined or lost. Captain Daewoo woke up early in the morning when the strange alien sun was just starting to rise through the thick forest canopy. His back was sore from sleeping on the hard metal floor of the wrecked ship, but he felt better than most of the other survivors. Dr. Yuki had cleaned the cut on his forehead and said he would be fine. Bryn, the small furry engineer, was making soft, whimpering sounds that meant she was very hungry. Her species came from a desert planet where they ate special nutrition cubes that were made in factories. The thought of eating anything that grew naturally made her fur stand up with fear. She kept asking Daewoo when the rescue ships would come, but he did not have any good answers for her. The massive rock creature was sitting very still in one corner of the makeshift shelter they had built from pieces of the broken ship. His rocky skin was starting to develop small cracks, which meant his body was beginning to shut down from lack of food. His species ate a special type of mineral paste that had to be prepared in laboratory conditions. Clicks, the blue navigation officer, was the worst off of all the survivors. His forearms were shaking, and his compound eyes had turned from bright blue to a sickly gray color. His species needed to eat liquid nutrients every few hours or they would become very sick. He was lying. On his side, breathing heavily and making clicking sounds that meant he was in pain. The other 9 survivors were in similar conditions. Each species had evolved to eat very specific types of food that were processed and prepared in controlled environments. The idea of eating raw plants or animals from an unknown planet was completely foreign to them. They would rather starve than risk poisoning themselves. Daewoo had been thinking about their situation all night while the others slept. He knew that if they waited for rescue, they would all die of starvation. The ship communication systems were completely broken, and they had no way to send out a distress signal. Even if someone was looking for them, it could take weeks or months to find them. On this uncharted planet, he decided to explore the forest around their crash site to see what resources might be available. The other survivors watched him with worry as he prepared to leave the safety of their shelter. They did not understand why he would want to go out into the dangerous alien wilderness when they should stay together and wait for help. The forest was unlike anything Daewoo had ever seen before. The trees were much taller than Earth trees and their leaves were different colors ranging from deep purple to bright orange. The ground was covered with a thick layer of what looked like moss, but felt springy under his feet like walking on a trampoline. As he walked deeper into the forest, he started to notice plants that looked familiar to him even though he knew they were alien species. There were bushes with small red berries that reminded him of cranberries from Earth. There were vines growing up the trees that had leaves shaped like grape leaves. There were even some plants that looked very similar to spinach and lettuces. Training in the Earth Colonial Defense Force had included survival courses where he learned to identify edible plants on different types of planets. The basic principles were the same across most worlds. Plants that were brightly colored or had strong smells were usually poisonous. Plants that grew in sunny areas and had simple leaves were usually safe to eat. He found a clear stream running through the forest about half a kilometer from the crash site. The water was clean and cold and tasted better than the recycled water they had been drinking on the ship. Near the stream, there were large patches of green leafy plants that looked very much like wild spinach. Daewoo carefully examined the plants using the techniques he had learned in survival training. He looked for signs of insect damage, which would mean the plants were probably safe for larger animals to eat. He smelled the leaves and they had a fresh green scent like vegetables. He even tasted a tiny piece of one leaf and it was slightly bitter, but not unpleasant. He spent the whole morning collecting different types of plants and berries and roots that he thought might be edible. He was very careful to only take small amounts of each type so he could test them safely. He also gathered some dry wood and found some stones that could be used for cooking. When he returned to the crash site with his arms full of plant materials, the other survivors looked at him like he had gone completely insane. Bryn backed away from him, making scared squeaking sounds. The plants he was carrying looked like weeds and garbage to her, and she could not understand why he would bring such things near their shelter. Surf rumbled in his rocky voice that those plants could be poisonous and that Daewoo was risking all their lives by bringing unknown organic matter into their safe area. Klix was too weak to say much, but his compound eyes were wide with terror as he looked at the alien vegetation. Dr. Yuki was the only one who seemed to understand what Daewoo was trying to do. She had studied human biology and knew that humans were omnivores who could eat many different types of food, but even she was worried about the risk of eating plants from an unknown world. The other survivors gathered around to watch as Daewoo began to sort through the plants he had collected. He separated them into different groups based on their appearance and smell. He explained that he was going to test each type carefully before anyone ate them, but the aliens were not convinced. They had all grown up in advanced civilizations, where food was manufactured in sterile facilities and tested by scientists before it was approved for consumption. The idea of eating something that grew wild in the dirt was completely against everything they had been taught about food safety. As the day went on, the hunger became worse and worse. Some of the aliens were starting to become delirious from lack of nutrition. Bryn was having trouble standing up and Zorth had stopped talking completely. Klix was drifting in and out of consciousness and his breathing was becoming very shallow. Daewoo knew that they were running out of time. If he was going to save his crew, he would have to take a risk and hope that his Human instincts about food were correct. He began to prepare for what he hoped would be their salvation, even though the others thought he was planning their destruction. The alien forest around them was full of life and food, but his companions could not see it that way. All they could see was danger and poison and death tomorrow. He would have to prove them wrong, or they would all die together. On this beautiful but hostile world, the massive transport ship called Galactic Harmony was flying through space when everything went wrong. Captain Tae-woo was sitting in his command chair, drinking his morning coffee when the first alarm started to sound. The red lights began flashing all over the bridge, and the ship started to shake like it was caught in a terrible storm. The navigation officer was a tall blue creature named Clicks, who had 4 arms and compound eyes like a giant insect. Clicks was clicking his mandibles very fast, which meant he was scared or excited. Tae-woo could not tell which one it was. The universal translator on his wrist was making buzzing sounds as it tried to keep up with all the different alien languages being spoken at once. Chief Engineer Bryn was a small furry creature about the size of a house cat, but she walked on 2 legs and had tiny hands that were very good at fixing things. She was running around the engine room screaming that the main power core was failing. The ship had been traveling for 3 days from the mining station on Kepler 442b to the trading post at Alpha Centauri when the engines just stopped working. Tae-woo pressed the communication button on his chair to talk to all the crew members at once. His voice was calm and steady, even though he could feel his heart beating fast inside his chest. He had been the captain of mixed species crews for over 10 years, and he knew that panic was the most dangerous thing in any emergency situation. The ship was falling toward a planet that was not supposed to be there, according to their star charts. This solar system was supposed to be empty except for a few asteroids and some gas clouds. But now, through the main viewing screen, they could see a green and blue world getting bigger and bigger as they fell toward its security officer. Zorth was a massive creature made of living rock who came from the asteroid mining colonies. His voice sounded like 2 mountains grinding together when he spoke. He was trying to get all the passengers to move to the emergency crash positions, but many of them were too scared to listen. Some of the alien passengers had never been in a ship crash before, and they did not know what to do. The ship had started this journey with 47 crew members and passengers from 12 different species. Most of them were traders and miners and scientists who traveled between the outer colonies. The cargo hold was full of rare metals and exotic foods that were worth millions of credits on the inner worlds. Dr. Yuki was the only other human on the ship besides Tae-woo. She was in the medical bay trying to prepare for injuries that would happen when they crashed. Her supplies were flying around the room because the artificial gravity was failing. She had to hold on to the walls to keep from floating to the ceiling. The main computer was speaking in a mechanical voice that stayed calm even though the ship was about to crash. It kept repeating the same message over and over. Emergency landing procedures are now in effect. All crew members report to crash positions immediately. This is not a drill. Through the viewing screen, Tae-woo could see that the planet below them was covered with thick forests and mountains. There were no cities or roads or any signs that intelligent life lived there. The atmosphere readings showed that the air was breathable for most species, but the gravity was slightly stronger than Earth normal. The ship was spinning as it fell through the atmosphere, and pieces of the hull were starting to break off and fly away. The heat shields were glowing red hot and making terrible grinding sounds as they tried to protect the ship from burning up. Small explosions were happening all over the ship as systems failed one after another. Bryn was still in the engine room, trying to restart the power core, but she was crying because nothing was working. The backup systems that should have kept them flying were also broken, and there was no way to slow down their fall toward the planet's surface. Cyclix was using his 4 arms to work at 3 different control panels at once, trying to find a safe place to crash land. His compound eyes could see much better than human eyes, and he was looking for a clearing in the forest where the trees were not too thick. The passengers were mostly staying in their quarters because they were too scared to move around the shaking ship. Some of them were praying to their various gods, and others was sending final messages to their families back home. The ship network was still working, so the messages would be sent out into space even if they did not survive. The Crushorth was moving through the ship, checking that all the emergency systems were working. His rocky body was so heavy that he did not get thrown around by the shaking like the other crew members. He was making sure that the emergency food supplies and medical equipment were secure. Tae-woo was thinking about his family back on Earth and wondering if he would ever see them again. He had a wife named Jinae and 2 children who were still in school. His son wanted to be a space pilot like his father, and his daughter wanted to be a doctor like Dr. Yuki. The ship hit the top of the forest canopy with a sound like thunder and immediately started breaking apart. Tree branches were smashing through the windows and walls as they crashed down through the forest. The main hull was strong enough to protect most of the people inside, but the outer sections were being torn away. They crashed into a clearing that was just barely big enough for the ship and slid for almost 100 meters before finally stopping against a group of very large trees. The silence after the crash was almost as scary as the noise had been during the fall. Tae-woo was hanging upside down in his command chair because the ship had rolled over during the crash. His head was bleeding from where he had hit the control panel, but he was still conscious and could move his arms and legs. He could hear people calling for help from different parts of the ship. The emergency lights were still working, but they were very dim and kept flickering on and off. The main computer was no longer speaking, and most of the screens were dark or showing error messages. The artificial gravity was completely gone, so everything that was not tied down was floating around. Dr. Yuki was calling out, asking if anyone was seriously hurt, and telling people to stay calm and not move too much until she could check them for injuries. Bryn was trapped under some fallen equipment in the engine room, and Zorth was using his strength to lift the heavy pieces off. Herclix was trying to get the emergency communication system working so they could send out a distress signal, but the main antenna had been broken off during the crash. The backup systems were also not working, which meant they had no way to call for help. When Tae-woo finally got out of his chair and looked around, he could see that they were in serious trouble. The ship was badly damaged and would never fly again. Most of their equipment was broken, and they were stranded on a planet that was not even on their star charts. Through a crack in the hull, he could see the alien forest outside, with its strange colored trees and plants that moved even though there was no wind. The air smelled different from any planet he had ever visited before, and he could hear sounds of creatures moving around in the forest. They were alive, but they were completely alone on a world that no one knew existed, and they had no way to call for rescue. 3 weeks after the crash landing, the survivors had completely transformed their temporary camp into a thriving community. Captain Tae-woo was teaching a group of alien crew members how to smoke fish they had caught in the forest stream when they heard the distant sound of ship engines approaching through the atmosphere. The rescue ship appeared through the forest canopy like a silver bird descending from the sky. The crew members, who had been preparing their morning meal, looked up with mixed emotions. They were happy to see help arriving, but they were also sad to leave the place that had become their home. Bryn was the first to spot the rescue ship with her sharp eyes. She had been gathering berries with 2 other crew members. When she saw the metallic glint through the trees, her small body was now strong and healthy with glossy fur that shone in the alien sunlight. Clicks was using his forearms to weave baskets from plant fibers when he heard the engine sounds. His compound eyes tracked the ship movement as it circled their camp, looking for a safe place to land. His blue skin was now bright and vibrant, showing that he was in perfect health. Zorth was sitting by the fire, roasting root vegetables when the rescue ship landed in the clearing where their own ship had crashed weeks earlier. His rocky body had completely healed from the mineral-rich plants he had been eating, and the cracks in his skin had disappeared. Dr. Yuki was examining some medicinal plants she had discovered when the rescue team emerged from their ship. She had been documenting the healing properties of various alien plants and had created an extensive database of their effects on different species. The rescue team consisted of professional search and rescue specialists from several different species. They had been searching for the missing transport ship for over 2 weeks and had finally detected the wreckage from orbit. They expected to find desperate, starving survivors clinging to life. Instead, they found a healthy, thriving community that had established gardens, food preservation systems, and even primitive cooking methods. The survivors were not only alive, but appeared to be in better health than when they had left their Home Station's Commander Vila, the leader of the rescue team, was a tall humanoid with green skin who had conducted hundreds of rescue operations. She had never seen anything like what she found at the crash site the survivors were supposed to be. Weak and desperate, but instead they were strong and confident. The medical officer on the rescue team was shocked when he examined the alien survivors. His scanners showed that most of them were in excellent health with improved nutrition levels and better physical condition than their baseline medical records indicated. Bryn had gained weight and her fur was thicker and shinier than before the crash. Her small body was full of energy and she was more alert and intelligent than she had been in years. The natural foods had provided nutrients that her processed diet had been missing. Clicks had regained all of his strength and his compound eyes were clearer and more focused than they had been since his youth. His forearms were coordinated and precise in their movements, showing that his nervous system was functioning perfectly. Lizarth had not only recovered from his malnutrition, but his rocky skin was harder and more resilient than before. The minerals from the alien plants had actually improved his physical structure beyond its original condition. Dr. Yuki had lost weight, but in a healthy way, and her human metabolism was running more efficiently than it had in years. The diverse alien foods had provided her body with a wider range of nutrients than her standard space rations. The other survivors showed similar improvements in their health and physical condition. Each species had found plants that provided exactly what their biology needed to function at peak efficiency. When Commander Vila asked how they had managed to survive without their emergency food supplies, Taewoo explained about the edible plants and the cooking techniques they had developed. The rescue team was amazed that beings from advanced civilizations had learned to forage and cook like primitive ancestors. The survivors had not only survived, but had rediscovered knowledge that their species had forgotten thousands of years ago. They had learned to work with the natural environment and use its resources sustainably. Several of the crew members asked if they could take seeds and plant samples back to their homeworlds. They wanted to introduce these natural foods to their own species and help them rediscover their traditional diets. Commander Vila was so impressed with what she saw that she requested permission to establish a research station on the planet. The Federation Science Council would want to study how different species could adapt to eating natural foods. The survivors loaded their rescue ship with carefully preserved seeds, plants, and detailed notes about their experiences. They had created the first interspecies guide to natural nutrition that could be used by beings throughout the galaxy when they returned to civilization. Their story became legendary among space travelers. The incident became known as the Weed Stir-Fry Revolution because it marked the moment when advanced civilizations began to rediscover the wisdom of their ancestors. Taewoo was promoted to admiral and put in charge of a new department that studied survival techniques and natural nutrition for space travelers. His simple act of cooking alien plants had started a movement that would change how the galaxy thought about food. Bryn became famous as an expert on interspecies foraging and was invited to speak at universities throughout the galaxy. Her small size and cute appearance made her a popular teacher who could explain complex concepts in simple terms. Glicks used his exceptional eyesight to become a consultant for agricultural projects on different worlds. His ability to see patterns that others missed made him valuable for identifying new food sources. Earth became a specialist in soil analysis and mineral nutrition, helping different species understand what their bodies needed to stay healthy. His geological knowledge was applied to farming and food production. Dr. Yuki wrote the definitive medical guide to natural nutrition for different species. Her research showed that processed foods had been causing nutritional deficiencies that natural foods could cure. The alien planet where they had crashed was designated as a protected natural preserve where scientists could study the relationship between different species and their food sources. It became a training ground for survival instructors. Museums on dozens of worlds created exhibits about the Weed Stir-Fry incident, showing how desperate circumstances had led to revolutionary discoveries. The story inspired millions of beings to reconnect with their natural heritage. Agricultural schools throughout the galaxy began teaching courses on traditional foods and sustainable farming methods. The processed food industry was forced to improve their products To include more natural nutrients, space travel regulations were changed to require all ships to carry survival training materials and guides to edible plants on different types of planets. The old system of relying only on processed emergency rations was recognized as dangerous. The survivors remained friends for the rest of their lives and met annually to share meals cooked over open fires using techniques they had learned on the alien planet. They had formed bonds that transcended species. Various years later, when Taiwu was asked about